Martin Luther King Day always made the city feel quieter, not in a peaceful way, in a careful way. Like the streets were holding their breath, waiting to see who would act kind and who would just pretend. I stood in our bathroom, staring at my reflection. The light above the mirror buzzed faintly. My tie was crooked. I fixed it, then fixed it again. My hands were steady, but my chest felt tight. From downstairs I heard my wife. She was not speaking to me, she was speaking to her phone. Her voice floated up the stairs like music. She said, "Today we honor dignity, we honor equality, we honor the dream of justice." I exhaled slowly. I stepped out of the bathroom. Our home smelled like expensive candles and cold distance. In the hallway I paused by the shelf where we kept framed photos. Wedding day, anniversary trip, a beach sunset where we looked happy. I touched the edge of one frame and kept walking. In the kitchen, the gift box sat on the counter. Small, neat. A simple ribbon. I picked it up. It was not expensive, it was personal. Inside was a gold pin shaped like a small open hand. A symbol of service. I bought it because my wife used to love what Martin Luther King Day stood for. Back when she cared. I walked toward the living room. She was near the window, wearing a sleek dress and checking her reflection in the dark glass. Her phone was held high. Her smile was perfect. Her eyes sparkled, but only because the camera needed them to. She said, "Tonight is our annual benefit gala. We will raise funds for scholarships and affordable housing. Tonight, we honor the legacy with action." She lowered her phone. Her smile disappeared instantly. Her face turned cold, like she had removed a mask. She looked at me and sighed. She said, "You are not wearing that." I glanced at my shirt. I said, "It is clean." She said, "It looks cheap, like you picked it up off the floor." My jaw clenched. I stayed calm. I said, "I can change." She waved her hand like my words were a fly. She said, "Do what you want. Just do not embarrass me tonight." I held out the gift box. I said, "I got you something. For today." She looked at it for half a second. Then she looked away. She said, "Not now." I said, "It will take 1 second." She stepped closer, her voice dropping. She said, "Do you want me to be honest? You are not coming anywhere near the stage." I blinked. I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "You will be there. You will sit, you will clap, and you will stay invisible." She turned back toward the window and adjusted her hair. She said, "Donors are coming. Sponsors are coming. Media is coming. This night matters." I said, "What about our marriage? Does it matter?" That made her laugh, not a happy laugh, a sharp, bitter sound. She said, "Marriage does not pay for scholarships." I felt something twist inside me. I said, "So I am an inconvenience now." She turned, her eyes narrowing. She said, "You have always been an inconvenience. You just did not notice." The words stung, but I did not move. I set the gift box down on the counter gently, like it was fragile. My phone vibrated in my pocket. Unknown number. My wife noticed. Her eyes flicked toward my pocket. She said, "Who is that?" I did not answer. I stepped away and took the call. A calm voice spoke with the kind of control that comes from authority. The voice said, "Sir, this is your reminder. Do not engage tonight, do not intervene. We need everything clean." I swallowed. I said, "Understood." The voice said, "If you feel tempted, remember what is at stake. Keep your emotions out of it." I said, "I will." The voice said, "Good. We will be watching." The call ended. I stared at my phone. Behind me, my wife scoffed. She said, "Who was that?" "Some client calling to complain." I turned slowly. I looked at her face, at the perfection, at the emptiness behind it. I said, "Tonight, just do not lie." Her eyes widened, offended. She said, "You do not get to police me." I said, "You keep talking about dignity, Martin Luther King Day, equality, justice." She stepped closer, angry now. She said, "Do not do this." I said, "If you are going to preach it to strangers, you should be able to live it at home." She stared at me like I had slapped her. Then she smirked. She said, "If you love me, you will stay quiet." She grabbed her phone again and walked toward the stairs. She said, "And tonight you will learn your place." She disappeared upstairs. I remained in the living room alone. I looked at the gift box on the counter. Then I looked at the wedding photo on the wall, and I understood something that made my stomach drop. My wife was not just drifting away. She was planning to cut me off in front of everyone. She was going to turn humiliation into entertainment. She had no idea that tonight was not her stage. Tonight was evidence. Cliffhanger. That morning, I still did not know what would hurt more: being humiliated in public, or watching my wife destroy herself without realizing it. From the outside, we looked like the kind of couple people envied. My wife was smart, beautiful, charismatic. She had a job that looked noble, a nonprofit organization that focused on scholarships, housing programs, and youth services. She spoke at events. She took photos with volunteers. She wore shirts with slogans. She knew how to cry on command. I was her husband, quiet, supportive, a man who stood a half step behind her during photo ops. People said things like, "You are lucky." They said it to me like I had won a prize. They said it to her like she was a goddess. I used to believe it. I used to look at her and think I was witnessing something rare. Back then, her passion was real. She would come home exhausted and still talk about the families she met. She would say, "I want to change something." I respected that. I loved that. I helped however I could. I drove her to events. I carried boxes. I listened to her rehearse speeches. I celebrated her wins. But then something changed. It was slow, like water wearing down stone. One day, she started caring less about impact and more about visibility. She cared about who was watching her, who praised her, who posted her, who tagged her. It started with small complaints. She said, "You never network." She said, "You do not understand how this works." She said, "Men with ambition do not hide in the shadows." I told myself it was stress. Nonprofit work was hard, sponsors could be demanding, fundraising targets could be cruel, but the truth was more personal. She stopped seeing me as her partner. She started seeing me as her embarrassment. One night, after a dinner event, she sat in the car and stared at herself in the mirror. She said, "I think people judge me because of you." I laughed, thinking she was joking. She did not laugh. She said, "I am serious. You do not look like you belong in my world anymore." That was the first time I felt the floor shift under my marriage. I asked, "What world?" "Our world." She said, "Not ours, mine." And that was the word that kept growing between us. Mine. My mission, my career, my donors, my stage. In public, she was all warmth. In private, she was cold. She would rehearse speeches about dignity, then criticize my clothes. She would talk about compassion, then treat me with contempt. The hypocrisy was not just painful, it was confusing. Because sometimes, in quiet moments, she still looked like the woman I married. Like when she laughed at a silly video. Like when she forgot to pose and just existed. But those moments became rare. And when they did happen, she would snap out of them like they were mistakes. That morning, she practiced her gala speech again. She stood by the mirror and whispered like she was praying. She said, "Dignity is not a privilege, it is a right." Then she saw me pouring coffee. Her expression changed. She said, "Do not spill that on the counter. This place is not a mess like your office." I stared at her. I asked, "Do you even hear yourself?" She snapped. She said, "I hear myself fine. I hear you dragging me down." I said, "Dragging you down how?" She pointed at my shirt. She said, "By looking like that, by acting like you do not care, by standing next to me like a shadow." I took a breath. I said, "I do care. I just do not need strangers to clap for me." That made her furious. She said, "That is why you are a nobody." I froze. Not because she insulted me, because she said it like she believed it. like she had rewritten our marriage in her head, and I was the villain in her story. I walked out of the kitchen and into the hallway. I opened the closet. I pulled out a dark jacket. Simple. Well-fitted, not flashy. She watched me and laughed. She said, "You think that makes you respectable." I looked at her and said, "No, I think my character makes me respectable." She rolled her eyes like she was bored of morality. She said, "Tonight, you will see what respect looks like." Cliffhanger. At that moment, I did not understand what she meant. But I would soon learn. My wife believed respect came from power, and she was willing to crush anyone, even me, to feel powerful. The hotel ballroom was already busy when we arrived. Staff moved fast. Donor tables had name cards. Servers carried trays of sparkling water. A photographer tested lights near the stage. The screen behind the podium showed a clean design. Martin Luther King Day Benefit Gala. Scholarships, housing, service. It looked beautiful. It looked righteous. My wife walked in like she owned the room. She nodded at staff. She adjusted a banner. She whispered to the event coordinator. She smiled at the right people. And she ignored me like I was part of the furniture. At the far end of the ballroom, I saw Cameron Hale. He was not a board member. He was not a volunteer. He was the sponsor. He was money wearing a suit. He stood beside the sponsor table, shaking hands and laughing loudly. People leaned toward him like sunflowers toward light. My wife practically floated to him. She said, "Cameron, you made it." Cameron smiled, slow and confident. He said, "Would not miss it. You are the star tonight." My wife blushed like a teenager. She said, "Stop." He leaned closer. He said, "I mean it. This organization is lucky to have you." She said, "I am lucky to have partners like you." Cameron laughed. He said, "Partners. I like that word." His eyes drifted to me. He looked me up and down. His smile did not reach his eyes. He said, "And you are?" My wife answered too quickly. She said, "My husband." No warmth, no pride, just a label. Cameron held out his hand. He said, "Nice to meet you." I shook his hand. His grip was firm but careless, like he was touching something disposable. He said, "So, you support her mission?" I said, "I support her." He tilted his head. He said, "That is not what I asked." My wife laughed nervously. She said, "He does not understand how this world works." Cameron smiled. He said, "Oh, I can tell." He leaned toward my wife and lowered his voice, but not enough. He said, "He is bad for optics." My wife's face tightened. She said, "I know." That stung, even though I expected it. Cameron continued. He said, "You said you wanted the promotion." My wife nodded quickly. He said, "Then stop bringing him into my space." My wife swallowed. She said, "I will handle it." Cameron smiled like he had won something. He said, "Good girl." My stomach turned. I watched my wife's reaction. She did not look insulted. She looked rewarded. That was when I understood something. Cameron did not just sponsor her organization. He sponsored her ego. And she was addicted. They walked away together, leaving me standing alone. I blended into the crowd. I listened. I watched. The gala began. The master of ceremonies welcomed everyone. The first segment highlighted scholarship recipients. Young people walked on stage. The crowd applauded. My wife smiled and wiped a fake tear. Then came housing. A short video played. Families smiling. Keys handed over. Donors applauding themselves. And through it all, Cameron watched like a man watching his own reflection. During a break, my wife crossed the room toward me. She leaned in and whispered. She said, "Do not say anything stupid tonight." I asked, "Why do you talk to me like I am your enemy?" She said, "Because you act like one." I said, "How?" She said, "By existing." Then she walked away before I could respond. The cruelty was so casual it almost felt surreal, but the worst part was her confidence. She was confident because she thought the room belonged to her, and she thought Cameron was the highest power there. She was wrong. Cliffhanger. As the lights dimmed for the next segment, I felt my phone vibrate. Unknown number, a text message. It said, "Stay calm. Let them talk. We are almost there." Backstage, my wife was in her element. She held a clipboard and spoke like a commander. She said, "After the housing segment, we move into honoring supporters. Keep the cameras on me, and do not cut away when I call my husband." The producer hesitated. The producer said, "Is this appropriate for Martin Luther King Day?" My wife smiled politely, but her eyes were sharp. She said, "It is inspirational. People need stories." Cameron stepped closer. He said, "People love this. Strong woman, weak husband. It will make you look unstoppable." My wife nodded. She said, "Exactly." The producer looked uncomfortable. The producer said, "If he is embarrassed..." Cameron waved a hand. He said, "Embarrassment builds character." My wife laughed. She said, "He needs it." I stood in the hallway just around the corner. I could hear everything clearly. Not because they were whispering, because they did not think my feelings mattered. My wife walked out and found me. She grabbed my sleeve and pulled me into a quiet corner. Her smile was still on, but it looked strained. She said, "Listen, in 10 minutes I'm going to call you to the stage." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I need the room to understand who I am." I asked, "And who am I in that story?" She stared at me. She said, "You are the part I overcame." My chest tightened. I said, "That is disgusting." She leaned in. She whispered, "You will stand there. You will smile. You will not speak. And when I am done, you will disappear." I said, "You are humiliating me for applause." She said, "Do not be dramatic. This is how the world works." I said, "No, this is how selfish people work." Her eyes widened. For a second, I thought she might hit me. Then she steadied herself. She said, "If you ruin this for me, I will destroy you." I said, "You are already destroying something." She said, "What?" I answered quietly. I said, "Your own soul." She scoffed. She said, "Save the sermon." She walked away. My phone vibrated again. Unknown number. Another message. It said, "No intervention. Everything must happen naturally. Naturally. Like cruelty was natural. Like humiliation was just weather." I stared at the message. Then I looked at my wife on stage, rehearsing her next lines with the master of ceremonies. She smiled like the mission was holy, and I felt a cold understanding. This was not just a relationship issue, this was a moral collapse, and tonight it was going to be recorded. Cliffhanger. The next segment began. The lights shifted, and my wife stepped toward the microphone with the kind of confidence only ignorance can create. The master of ceremonies introduced the segment. He said, "Now we would like to honor supporters who represent the spirit of service." My wife walked forward. She looked radiant. The spotlight made her shine. She clasped the microphone with both hands. She said, "Martin Luther King Day reminds us that dignity is not about status." I almost laughed, but I did not. My wife continued. She said, "It is about how we choose to serve." She paused, letting the room soak in her words. Then she smiled. She said, "There is someone I want to recognize tonight. Someone who has been with me through every struggle." The crowd leaned in. My wife's eyes found mine. She said, "My husband." A ripple went through the room. Heads turned, phones lifted. I felt my stomach knot. Not because I feared the stage, because I knew my wife, and I knew she wanted blood. I walked toward the stage. The room felt huge. The lights were harsh. The air was thick. I stepped up. My wife wrapped an arm around my waist and squeezed. It felt like a grip. She whispered without moving her lips. She said, "Smile." I smiled slightly. It was the smallest smile possible. My wife turned to the crowd. She said, "When I started this journey, I did not have anything." She gestured toward herself. She said, "I had passion. I had discipline. I had a dream." Then she gestured toward me. She said, "And I had him." She laughed softly. The crowd chuckled. My wife continued. She said, "He always wanted to be seen. He always wanted to be part of the story." She tilted her head like she was amused. She said, "But the truth is, he never contributed anything meaningful." The laughter grew. Not everyone laughed. Some people looked uncomfortable. But enough laughed to make it humiliating. I stood still. I did not fight. I did not react. Because if I reacted, it would become personal, and tonight could not be personal. Tonight had to be clean. My wife continued. She said, "Some people confuse proximity to success with being part of it." She squeezed me tighter. Then she leaned into the microphone and spoke like she was sharing wisdom. She said, "Do not let anyone hold you back from impact." The crowd applauded her, for humiliating her husband. Cameron Hale stood from his table. He walked to the stage with a confident grin. He took the microphone like it belonged to him. He said, "Real impact comes from real money." The room laughed. Cameron continued. He said, "Tonight, we celebrate leaders, not passengers." He looked at me. He said, "Not dead weight." My wife's smile widened. She looked at me like she had finally crushed something. I glanced at the audience. I saw the compliance officer near the wall, watching quietly, a small notebook in her hand. I knew she was recording time, words, proof. My wife and Cameron were not just humiliating me. They were exposing themselves. Backstage after the segment, my wife pulled me off the stage fast. Her nails dug into my arm. She whispered, furious. She said, "See? That was not hard, just stay quiet." I looked at her. I said, "You talk about dignity and then do that." She hissed. She said, "Shut up. Cliffhanger." My phone vibrated. A message from unknown number. It said, "Good. He is getting comfortable. Keep going." He, not my wife, not me, Cameron. After the humiliation, I walked toward the side corridor again. The manager from earlier approached me. He said quietly, "They are ready." I nodded. He led me through the hallway, into a smaller room near the service elevators. Inside were the compliance officer and the older man again. The older man looked at me with quiet respect. He said, "You handled that well." I asked, "Do we have what we need?" The compliance officer opened her notebook. She said, "We have multiple statements that indicate donor coercion." I asked, "Is it enough?" She said, "Almost." The older man said, "The board chair needs something direct, a clear line that proves control, not just arrogance." I thought of Cameron's words. Real money, dead weight, passengers. Arrogance was not enough. We needed coercion. We needed him to claim ownership over decisions, ownership over people. The compliance officer continued. She said, "Your wife is being used. She is becoming part of the evidence trail." I felt a sharp pain in my chest. I said, "She chose this." The older man nodded. He said, "Still, it is difficult." The compliance officer slid a small paper toward me. It was a legal consent form for a statement later. She said, "We will need your testimony as well." I signed quickly. My signature looked clean, calm. I did not feel calm. I asked, "Where's the board chair right now?" The older man said, watching from upstairs, waiting for the line. The compliance officer added, "And we have one more concern." I asked, "What?" She said, "Cameron is pushing for direct influence over staffing and program decisions." That made my stomach drop. I said, "That crosses the line." She nodded. She said, "Yes. And if he says it on the floor in public, it becomes undeniable." I took a breath. I said, "So we let him talk." The older man said, "Yes." I asked, "What about my wife? She will keep humiliating me." The compliance officer looked at me with a calmness that felt cruel, but real. She said, "Sometimes the truth only shows itself when people feel safe enough to be ugly." I nodded. I understood. This night was not about revenge. It was about stopping a corrupt power from wearing a charitable mask. I pinned the microphone deeper in my jacket. I said, "Tell me what to do next." The compliance officer said, "Do not provoke, do not threaten. Keep your words short. Let them expose themselves." I said, "And if my wife begs me to stop?" The compliance officer replied, "Do not intervene, not yet." I stared at the wall for a second. Then I looked up. I said, "Okay." I walked back toward the ballroom. The music was louder now. The crowd was drinking. Cameron looked relaxed. My wife looked energized. And I realized something that made my skin crawl. They thought they had won. That is when people become careless. Cliffhanger. Twist one was clear now. I was not here to be honored. I was here to document coercion in real time. And the next humiliation would push Cameron into saying the line that would end him. The gala continued. Dinner was served. Plates clinked. Wine glasses glowed under warm lights. People talked about vacations, stock portfolios, and how good it felt to be generous. My wife floated between tables, greeting donors. She laughed loudly. She touched shoulders. She posed for photos. Then she returned to me and spoke without warmth. She said, "Stand straight, you look pathetic." I said, "Is that what you think? That I am pathetic?" She replied, "Yes, and you are making me look bad." I stared at her. I said, "You are making yourself look bad." She stepped close. She said, "You do not understand what is happening. Cameron expects results." I said, "Cameron is not your boss." She laughed. She said, "Cameron is the reason my program exists." I said, "That is not something to be proud of." Her eyes flashed. She said, "If you want to be proud, go get rich." That was when Cameron appeared again. He held a glass in his hand like a trophy. He said, "There she is, the star." My wife smiled instantly. Cameron looked at me. He said, "You are still here." I said, "It is a public event." He chuckled. He said, "Sure, but this space is different. This is donor space." I stayed calm. I said, "It is a charity space." Cameron's smile tightened. He leaned toward my wife and spoke loudly enough for people nearby to hear. He said, "Next year, I want different leadership. More control, less mess." My wife nodded quickly. She said, "I can do that." That was it, that line. Different leadership, more control. It was not just arrogance now, it was influence. My wife looked at me with a warning. She said, "You are done tonight. I do not want you near the stage again." I said, "You already brought me up once." She replied, "And I will do it again if I need to." I felt the room spinning slightly. Not from anger, from the sudden clarity of what she was willing to do. Then the master of ceremonies announced the next segment. Silent auction closing. Sponsor remarks. My wife walked toward the stage. Cameron walked behind her. I followed at a distance. The compliance officer watched from the side. My phone vibrated. Unknown number, a text. It said, "He is close. Let him speak. Do not interrupt." Cliffhanger. My wife reached the microphone. Cameron stood beside her, and I could tell they were about to do it again. Only this time, the humiliation would come with a threat. The master of ceremonies handed my wife the microphone. She smiled. She said, "Before our sponsor speaks, I want to share something personal." The room leaned in. People loved personal. Personal made them feel like insiders. My wife continued. She said, "Behind every strong leader is sacrifice." She looked toward me. She said, "Sometimes that sacrifice is realizing you have outgrown the people who once supported you." A few murmurs, a few uneasy laughs. My stomach tightened. My wife looked at Cameron. He nodded slightly, like giving permission. Then she said it. She said, "After tonight, I will be filing for divorce." Gasps. Phones lifted again. The humiliation was not private. It was public branding. It was a signal to donors. A signal to Cameron. My wife called my name again. She said, "Come up here, right now." I walked to the stage. My footsteps felt heavy. I stood beside her in the spotlight again. My wife held up a stack of papers. Draft petition. She showed the top page like it was a trophy. She said, "This will be filed on Monday." Cameron smiled. He took the microphone for a moment. He said, "Sometimes leadership requires cutting dead weight." Laughter. My wife shoved a pen toward me. She said, "Sign that you received it." I looked at the pen, then I looked at her. I said, calmly, "File it, I will not stop you." My wife froze, her eyes widened. She expected begging, she expected tears. Cameron frowned. He stepped closer to me. He said quietly, "You do not get choices. You are nothing. People like you stay quiet." The compliance officer wrote fast. The room was silent now, not laughing, listening. My wife looked at Cameron like she had never heard him talk like that. A small crack appeared in her confidence. She whispered, "Cameron." He ignored her. He looked at me and said louder for the room to hear. He said, "I fund this mission. I decide who belongs on this stage." There it was, the line. The ownership, the coercion. The compliance officer did not just write. She nodded once, sharply. My phone vibrated. Unknown number. It said, "Enough. Board chair is moving." My wife saw the shift in the room. She sensed something. She whispered at me through her smile. She said, "What did you do?" I said quietly, "I did not do anything." I paused. I said, "You did, cliffhanger." My wife tried to smile at the crowd again, but her face trembled. And then she heard a new voice from the balcony. "The board chair," he said, "we need to pause the program." The room froze. My wife looked up at the balcony. Her eyes widened. She did not expect the board chair to intervene. Sponsors did not get interrupted. My wife tried to laugh. She said into the microphone, "Of course. Thank you." Her voice sounded thin. Cameron leaned toward her and whispered. He said, "Do not let him take this." My wife nodded, panicked. Then she tried to move on. She said, "Let us continue with sponsor remarks." But the board chair was already walking down the stairs, calm and controlled. He stepped onto the stage. He looked at the crowd. He did not smile. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize. We need to correct something." Cameron forced a laugh. He said, "This is a fundraiser, not a courtroom." The board chair glanced at him. He said, "The integrity of this mission is not for sale." My wife swallowed hard. She whispered, "What is happening?" The board chair turned to me briefly. He nodded once. That was permission. I stepped forward. I asked the master of ceremonies for the microphone. The master hesitated, then handed it to me. My wife tried to stop me. She whispered, "Do not do this." I looked at her. I said, "You already did." I faced the crowd. I kept my voice calm. I said, "Tonight is Martin Luther King Day." Silence. I said, "My wife spoke about dignity." I paused. I said, "Dignity is not something you wear on stage." My wife clenched her jaw. I continued. I said, "You preach dignity and then stripped it at home." Gasps. I said, "You called it leadership, but it was performance." My wife snapped. She said, "You are trying to ruin me." I looked at her. I said, "You ruined yourself the moment you needed strangers to clap more than you needed truth." Cameron stepped forward. He said, "Who are you to lecture us?" I turned to him. I said, "Not your employee." He smirked. He said, "Then what are you?" I took a breath. I said, "A man who cares about the mission more than your ego." The board chair raised a hand gently. He said, "That is enough." He looked at the crowd. He said, "This organization has policies. We have a mission. We have standards." Then he looked directly at Cameron. He said, "And we have evidence of donor coercion." The room erupted with murmurs. My wife looked like she might faint. Cameron went still. The board chair spoke again. He said, "We are not doing this as drama. We are doing this as governance." Cliffhanger. Cameron opened his mouth, ready to argue. Then the screen behind the stage flickered. A new slide appeared. And my wife saw a name she recognized, but never expected to be tied to me. The slide was simple, professional, no dramatic music, just words. Principal benefactor, the Hartwell Foundation. Years of contribution. Housing initiative funding. Scholarship endowment support. The crowd murmured louder. Some donors leaned forward, recognizing the name. My wife stared at the screen. Her lips parted. She whispered, "No." The board chair spoke clearly. He said, "The Hartwell Foundation has supported this mission from the beginning." He paused. He said, "They requested privacy, not because they fear attention, but because they believe the work matters more than applause." He turned and gestured toward me. He said, "The man standing here is the authorized representative and counsel for the Hartwell Foundation." The room snapped into silence again. Then applause began. Not wild, not messy, respectful applause. The kind that says, "We misjudged you." My wife looked at me like she was seeing a stranger. She whispered, "You did not tell me." I answered quietly. I said, "You stopped listening a long time ago." Cameron forced a smile. He said, "Okay, great. Congratulations. So we can talk like adults in private." I looked at him. I said, "No. We talk with accountability." Cameron laughed. He said, "Accountability, do not be naive." He stepped forward and spoke louder. He said, "I fund this organization too. Without my money, this mission dies." The board chair did not blink. The compliance officer standing near the side wrote rapidly. The board chair spoke again. He said, "Thank you for stating that on record." Cameron frowned. He said, "What record?" The board chair replied calmly. He said, "The record that will be reviewed." My wife clutched the microphone like she needed it to stand upright. She whispered, "This is about him, not me." I turned to her. I said, "You made it about you on Martin Luther King Day." My wife shook her head. She said, "I did what I had to do." I said, "Cruelty is never necessary." Cliffhanger. Cameron finally realized the room was no longer his. His smile vanished, and for the first time that night, fear flashed in his eyes. The board chair lifted the microphone again. He spoke like a man reading from a policy manual, because that is how real consequences are delivered, not with screaming, with procedure. He said, "Due to statements and conduct observed tonight, we are initiating a formal compliance review." Cameron tried to laugh. It sounded forced. He said, "You cannot be serious. This is a sponsor relationship." The board chair looked at him. He said, "The mission is not a toy for sponsors." Cameron stepped forward. He said, "I have invested too much in this to be treated like a criminal." The compliance officer stepped closer, calm. She said, "We are not calling you a criminal. We are documenting coercion and conflict of interest." Cameron's face flushed. He said, "You work for donors like me." That sentence was a second gift of evidence. The board chair nodded slightly. He said, "Effective immediately, the partnership with your corporate entity is suspended pending investigation." The room erupted. Phones lifted. Whispers became a wave. Some people stood, not to protest, to create distance. Cameron stared at the board chair. He said, "You cannot do that." The board chair replied, "We already did." Cameron turned to my wife. His voice dropped. He hissed, "Fix this." My wife stared at him, trembling. She said, "You promised me a promotion." Cameron snapped, louder than he meant to. He said, "You were supposed to control your husband." That was the deal. The room heard it. That was the moment my wife died socially, because it exposed what she truly was, not a leader, a performer being bought. My wife covered her mouth. She whispered, "No." I looked at her. I said, "That is what coercion looks like." She started to cry, but it was too late. The board chair raised a hand again. He said, "We are ending the sponsor segment now. We will proceed with the rest of the program under interim protocols." Interim protocols. Policy language. The kind that ends power quietly. Security approached Cameron calmly. No grabbing, no violence, just control. Cameron looked around and realized no one was coming to save him. Because in rooms like this, people worship power until power becomes inconvenient. Then they disappear. Cameron walked backward, stunned. My wife turned to me, shaking. She whispered, "Please, do not let them destroy me." I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "I am not destroying you." I paused. I said, "I am stopping you from destroying others." Cliffhanger. My wife realized she had not just lost a sponsor, she had lost the story she built her entire identity on. And now she had to face who she was without applause. Backstage was quiet. The ballroom was still alive behind us, but the hallway felt like a different universe. My wife followed me, crying softly. Her heels clicked on the carpet. She grabbed my arm. She said, "Please, just listen." I stopped. I did not pull away, but I did not comfort her either. She spoke fast. She said I was under pressure. Cameron threatened the funding. He threatened my career. I thought I had to prove myself. I looked at her. I said, "Prove yourself by humiliating your husband." She flinched. She said, "I did not want it to go that far." I said, "But it did, and you did not stop." She shook her head. She said, "You do not understand. In my world, perception is everything." I answered, "Then your world is rotten." She stared at me like I had insulted her religion. She said, "How can you say that?" I said, "Because I watched you preach dignity to strangers while you destroyed it at home." She tried to step closer. I stepped back. She whispered, "I did not know you were connected to the Hartwell Foundation." I laughed once, quietly, not amused, tired. I said, "That is the point. You never cared to know who I was." She cried harder. She said, "I did." "I did at first," I said. "At first." She looked down. She said, "I wanted to be important." I replied, "You were already important." She looked up quickly. She said, "To who?" I said, "To me. To the people you could have helped if you stayed honest." She wiped her tears. She said, "Can we fix this? Please." The desperation in her voice was real, but the damage was real too. I said, "You held divorce papers up like a trophy." She whispered, "I was trying to survive." I said, "Survival does not justify cruelty." She looked at me like the words were knives. Then she asked the question that broke my heart the most. She said, "Were you ever proud of me?" I took a breath. I spoke slowly. I said, "I was proud when you served people without needing applause." I paused. I said, "I stopped being proud when you started using people as props." She covered her face. She said, "I ruined everything." I said, "Yes." Silence. Then I reached into my jacket and pulled out the draft divorce petition she had shoved at me earlier. I handed it back to her. I said, "File it. Tell the truth." She stared at the papers. She said, "So that is it." I said, "That is it." My phone vibrated. Compliance message. It said, "Statement request pending." "Thank you," I replied. I wrote, "I will cooperate." My wife saw the message. She whispered, "This was planned." I shook my head. I said, "The review was planned. Your cruelty was not. That was your choice." She sank against the wall. She looked small for the first time in years. Cliffhanger. As I walked away, I knew the final consequence would not come from me. It would come from policy. Paper. The quiet kind of justice that does not care about tears. I sat in my car in the parking garage. I did not start the engine right away. My hands rested on the steering wheel. The silence felt loud. In the mirror, I could still see the ballroom entrance far away. Tiny figures. Tiny movements. A world that pretended to be noble. I thought about Martin Luther King Day again. Not the speeches, not the slogans, the real message. How you treat people when you think no one is watching. My wife treated me like a prop. And tonight, the truth treated her like evidence. My phone buzzed. Message from the board chair. He wrote, "Thank you for protecting the integrity of the mission. The review will proceed." I read it twice, then I typed back. I wrote, "Keep it clean. That is all I care about." I put the phone down. I stared at the concrete wall ahead of me. I expected to feel satisfied. I expected to feel victorious. But victory in real life does not always feel like fireworks. Sometimes it feels like grief, because the person who falls is someone you once loved. A few minutes later, I saw her in the mirror. My wife. She walked into the garage like she'd forgotten how to walk. Her shoulders were shaking. Her phone was in her hand. She stared at the screen like it was an execution letter. She stopped near a pillar and sank to the floor. No makeup touch-ups, no smile, no stage. Just a woman facing the truth without an audience. I did not need to guess what happened. That email had arrived. Administrative leave pending investigation. In the nonprofit world, those words are poison. It meant her organization had removed her from the public view. It meant her access would be limited. It meant people would start whispering. And in her world, whispers were death. She covered her mouth. She tried to breathe. Her phone slipped from her hand and hit the concrete. She stared at it like it was a broken mirror. I watched her for a moment. Part of me wanted to go to her, to comfort her, to remind her of who she used to be. But another part of me remembered the stage, the spotlight, the way she smiled while humiliating me. And I realized comfort would be disrespecting myself. So I looked away. I started the engine. The car hummed softly. I drove forward slowly, passing the line where shadows ended and light began. As I drove up the ramp, my eyes burned slightly. Not from rage, from exhaustion. I did not know what the future would look like. Court filings, statements, depositions. The slow administrative process of ending a marriage, but I knew one thing. I would not beg for dignity again, because dignity is not a gift someone gives you. It is a line you stop letting people cross. I exited the garage. The city air felt colder, cleaner, like the world was reminding me that nights like this do not define you. How you walk away does. Ending line. A man does not need to shout who he is. He only needs to let truth stand where it belongs. Call to action. If you were in my place, would you forgive her? Or would you let her face the consequences of what she chose? Comment dignity if you believe respect matters more than status. And subscribe for the next story, because what happened after this night was even more shocking.